After all, we all want the same things that honest, hardworking Canadians want for themselves and their families. And that is, Madam Speaker, simply a safer country. A country where criminals do not get off with a slap on the wrist, but instead are held to account and have to face the full weight and consequences of their actions and real difficult changes to their lives before rejoining society. This is appropriate, and that is why our government was elected to do, and that is why we're putting forth multiple pieces of legislation to protect Canadians such as C-39, and will continue to do so. And I ask all honourable members to vote in favour of this bill. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Scarborough River.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This particular bill, Madam Speaker, contains several legislative adjustments, amendments to the Corrections and Conditional Release Act. And while I wish the government had done a similar thing in their criminal code amendments, instead of having one or two bills in front of the House, we've got half a dozen, each one tweaking some other little piece of the criminal code. And I know the government's done it for political purposes, but in this particular bill involving corrections, they have bundled things together, which I accept. And I'm not one of those who would put a price on public safety, the cost of public safety. I'm just wondering, with all of these changes, if the member can remind us or reveal to us the costs of these proposed legislative amendments.
The honourable member for Edmonton St. Albert.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for Rouge River for that good question. He will recall, no doubt, that Budget 2008 invested $478.8 million over 5 years to initiate the implementation of the new vision for federal corrections. So this money was earmarked. The government feels very strongly that offenders ought to be held accountable, and that the action, the recommendations of the independent panel ought to be implemented, and has accordingly allocated funds to do so. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Burnaby, New Westminster.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. I listened to great interest to my colleague, and he talks about the additional funding that will go into to build prisons. But I'd like him to respond to one of the strongest criticisms that's been levied against this government, which is the cutbacks in crime prevention programs. Now, Madam Speaker, as you know full well, when you have crime prevention programs in place, for every dollar that you spend, you save $6 later on to the taxpayer in policing costs, and prison costs, and of course in court costs. So by preventing the crime at the very beginning, what you're actually doing is not only stopping having potential victims, but at the same time having a much more effective use of the taxpayer's dollar. Now, this Conservative government has cut back on crime prevention programs, and it's absolutely absurd, Madam Speaker, for the government to come forward saying that it wants to reduce crime when it's reducing crime prevention budgets. So could the member comment on why the Conservatives are willing to invest billions of dollars in building new prisons and are not willing to actually put money into preventing the crimes in the very first place, which is what the vast majority of Canadians support. Yeah.
The honourable member for Edmonton St. Albert.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank my friend from Burnaby, British Columbia, for his good question. I don't mean to diminish the effectiveness or the benefit of crime prevention programs, but our government has consulted with victims groups and with police officers, and it is the priority of this government to put the rights of law-abiding citizens first and paramount. Protection of society is the paramount principle of the correction system. Enshrining victim participation, guaranteeing victims' rights, those are our priorities. So I don't mean to diminish the value and effect that crime prevention operates, but at the end of the day, protection of society has to be the paramount principle, and Bill C-39 responds to that, Madam Speaker. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Mississauga, Arundel.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to take this opportunity to to commend the member for Edmonton St. Albert for the very fine work he does on the Parliamentary Justice Committee, where I have the privilege to work with him, representing his constituents and helping keep the people of Canada safe. My question, Madam Speaker, is has the member consulted with his constituents on this bill and on other government legislation designed to protect victims and stand up for law-abiding citizens, and perhaps he could inform the House on what his constituents may have said in that regard?
The honourable member for Edmonton St. Albert.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd also like to thank the member for Mississauga for his good question and for all the work that he does as Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice. It'll come to no surprise to the members of this House or to that member that in Edmonton I'm known as a bit of a justice hawk, and I frequently, through my householders and occasionally when I do 10%ers, I talk about justice issues and the work that this government is doing and the work that I'm doing on the Justice and Public Safety Committees. So yes, I have consulted widely with my constituents, both with respect to the correction system and offender accountability, and more broadly with the government's Safe Streets and Safe Community agenda, which puts protection of society paramount and puts protection of victims and victims' rights to the forefront of the criminal justice system. I can tell the member and all members of this House without equivocation that certainly my constituents unequivocally support this legislation.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, the 5 points that my honourable colleague talked about, increasing offender accountability, eliminating drugs for prisons, making parole and statutory release harder to get, and renewing physical infrastructure, which is a fancy way of saying building more prisons, all represent a philosophy of putting more people in jail for longer and making it more difficult for offenders to get access to rehabilitation, but instead trying to punish them into good behavior. And I'm just wondering if he can tell us, if he can name any jurisdictions that he's aware of, or any places that the government has studied where these policies have been put into place, where there has been a determined reduction in the crime rate, where communities were safer as a result of these policies. I wonder if you can name us, say 2 different jurisdictions where that's occurred.
The honourable member for Edmonton St. Albert.
I'd like to thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank the member from Vancouver Kingsway for his good question and for the work that he does as his party's public safety critic and for the work that he does on the Public Safety Committee. He's right that this bill represents a differing philosophy from the philosophy of his party, and I would suggest, Madam Speaker, a differing philosophy for most of the members on that side of the House, where they are focused on the rights of the offender. This government, and certainly myself, are preoccupied with the rights of society to be protected from violent offenders, to be protected from fraudsters, to protect victims, to give them a meaningful right in the process, and to promote safe streets and safe communities. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Markham Oak Ridges.
Oak Ridges, Markham, Madam Speaker. Thank you. We know, Madam Speaker, that crime actually costs the Canadian economy some $70 billion, more than $70 billion a year, and that the last stats that we have says that 67% of that is borne by the victims of crime. We know that auto theft is a massive deterrent to cost the Canadian economy $1 billion a year. I wonder if the honourable member would agree with me that and could comment on if he doesn't agree that one of the primary functions that we have to do as government is protect our people, and that it's about time that we stopped shifting the blame to the victims and started taking responsibility as a government, and if he would have some insights as to why the opposition would not be supporting making victims, the rights of victims, a priority in all of our criminal justice legislation. If there are any other bills that he might want to talk about that can give Canadians confidence that their justice system is finally being reformed to put the rights of victims ahead of criminals.
The honourable member for